Get in the game with NFL Sunday Ticket from Rev TV. You'll get every game every Sunday afternoon in crystal clear HD. That's over 220 football games for the entire regular season. Plus, NFL Sunday Ticket gives you up to 8 live games on one screen with Game Mix. You'll get that died and woke up in football heaven experience when you include NFL Red Zone, a channel dedicated to every scoring play from every game and all your fantasy football teams. Get in the game with NFL Sunday Ticket. Call 601-8992 today.
The F&M raising concerns about future potential borrowing by government. So is the Chamber of Commerce. Its CEO says the country is already walking on eggshells. The Prime Minister says he can't force residents not to rebuild in no-build zones. Plus, the Colina Group of companies makes a big donation for hurricane relief. We've got those stories and more coming up tonight. I'm Dana Smith, and MB12 starts right now. Topping news tonight, Free National Movement Chairman Michael Pintard asserted today that government may be adding to the country's national debt after Prime Minister Perry Christie revealed that the damage caused by Hurricane Joaquin will cost more than $60 million. And the government is looking to borrow that money from the Caribbean Development Bank and the Chinese. Simone Davis reports.
Pintard said the big question is, what is the government doing with the money collected from value-added tax this year? He said he thinks it's very premature for the government to decide to borrow money without completing a full assessment of damage caused on the various islands. He added that borrowing would only contribute to the national deficit, which would only worsen the problem.
It would be premature to say in the absence of a careful assessment. Again, the government, when asked about the use of funds or revenues raised by VAT, seem unclear on or certainly not committed to utilizing funds raised or revenues raised from VAT. Well, the reality is VAT in its original, the original intention of raising the VAT revenue was to pay down the national debt. Therefore, if you are borrowing, you are contributing to increasing the national debt. So it stands to reason that revenues earned from VAT can in fact be used in the recovery and reconstruction efforts.
Since Prime Minister Perry Christie said yesterday that no funds from value-added tax would be used for any relief efforts, Pintard said it's time for the government to come clean and be clear on exactly how VAT is being used.
Some persons project that approximately $300 million would be raised from VAT this year. If that is the case, then certainly the government should utilize some of those funds because, again, it prevents the further borrowing, which increases the national debt. If the government decides it does not intend to use any revenues from VAT, it is reasonable for the public to expect that the government would explain how are they presently using the revenue that has been raised from VAT.
He noted that the government should not completely remove the funds from VAT off the table, but it should be an option before choosing to borrow from the Caribbean Development Bank and the Chinese.
In the absence of a careful assessment, taking into consideration what we have said, it would be premature for the government to commit to borrowing. The government should certainly have that as one of several options in terms of funding. But for them to predetermine that they are going to borrow, in our estimation, would be premature.
An estimated 5,000 people were impacted by Hurricane Joaquin earlier this month, and it remains unclear how many homes were damaged or destroyed. According to Christie, the government's fundraising efforts would be chaired by senior bank executives who will ensure that the money raised is spent appropriately. When it comes to the funds that the government plans to borrow, Pintard said the government should be very specific and completely guided by proper assessments.
Any borrowing should be very specific and completely guided by objective assessment and taking into consideration the long-term needs of these communities. And to the extent that we have resources in our budget, whether from VAT or some other revenue stream, the government is obliged to use those funds or to give the public an explanation as to why it is not feasible or sensible to draw on those funds.
Reporting for NB12, I'm Simone Davis.
Well, any potential borrowing by government would have to be monitored very closely, according to the CEO of the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and Employers Confederation, Edison Sumner, who said today the country is already walking on eggshells and cannot afford to fall deeper into debt. He said the chamber is always concerned when government has to borrow money.
We would have to monitor this very closely. The Bahamas is already walking on eggshells as we see it economically. We can't afford to put ourselves any deeper in debt. We're already having challenges with rating agencies downgrading our sovereign credit ratings. We're having challenges with the Bahamas slipping on the World Bank reports as far as its competitiveness is concerned and ease of doing business. And now we have been hit with this great disaster that's hit the country that nobody was planning for.
Sumner said the Prime Minister's announcement that government may have to borrow money to assist in hurricane repairs is no surprise, given that the storm was somewhat surprising to many, and government obviously doesn't have the resources readily available to handle disaster issues. Sumner said borrowing is always a concern and mechanisms need to be in place to ensure transparency and accountability.
We're always concerned when government has to borrow money, right, for a number of reasons, and the main reason being that of transparency and accountability. What are the funds being borrowed for and how are the funds being spent?
First noting he believes it's likely government will go ahead and borrow money. Sumner said if those funds go towards assisting family island businesses in rebuilding, it shouldn't necessarily be free money. He suggested the Christie administration explore repayment options.
If the government goes through and borrows the money, and likely they will do so, we think that the relief that is being offered to persons in the family islands so impacted by the storm, particularly the business community, doesn't necessarily have to be free money to them, where the government simply gives them money to get the rebuilding done. Because some businesses may have the capacity to do for themselves. Some businesses may have the capacity to repay the government through some terms of a loan agreement or guaranteed scheme that it can be offered to them, and that perhaps over a period of time, the government might be able to recover some of that money that they're going to be spending on certain business developments.
Sumner also suggested government in the future consider insuring its public infrastructure.
I don't know if there's anything that precludes or prevents the government from purchasing insurance on its own infrastructure. Roads, bridges, school buildings, hospitals, clinics, and the rest of it. And that if those buildings, our infrastructure, our cell towers, our lamp poles, our water reserves, etc., if we were able to purchase insurance on those sets of infrastructure, it will also help to ease the government's burden when it comes time to repair and replace these important pieces of infrastructure.
Prime Minister Perry Christie said yesterday government cannot compel people on the family islands to not build homes in what are deemed as no-build zones unless legislation is passed in Parliament to identify those storm-affected areas as weak or not suitable for building.
I have to mention it. Right now, for example, we cannot compel people unless we pass the law to that effect. The Act empowers us to recognize vulnerable areas, to place ourselves in a position where we can say that you cannot build in that area. But you take a place in Acklands, for example, that was just utterly devastated. People have been living there for, I guess, 150 years. And so The point is, how do you go about telling people they can't build there?
Christie says while the matter is currently being discussed in cabinet, the most the government can do right now is encourage those Family Island residents to examine the areas where they wish to build and complete a full assessment before building in a vulnerable area that could be easily damaged by the storm.
The Roll brothers who had their homes destroyed, they were on the water side. They say that they don't want to build there again. They want to build on higher ground. And so the government will be encouraging people to look very carefully at that. And we will be requiring them to build with hurricanes in mind, which means that the foundation must be at a certain height for flooding or built on stilts in these islands. And so we're going to be very proactive, and those decisions are being made now.
In other news, a man was discovered floating lifeless in waters off Clifton Pier last night after allegedly falling off a cliff while fishing. According to police reports, shortly before 8 p.m., officers received a report that the man had fallen, and upon arriving at the scene, they discovered the man floating in the dock area at Clifton Pier. The victim was removed from the water and taken to shore, where he was pronounced dead. An autopsy will be performed to determine the exact cause of death. And police are asking the public to help in locating a missing 22-year-old man. Keandre Hanna of Sydney Street, Chippenham, was reported missing by family members last week Tuesday. He is described as having a slim build, dark brown complexion, and standing about 6 feet tall. He was last seen in New Providence this past Saturday. Stay with us. There's more news after the break.